Hey there, if you like this half of the painting, let's paint the other half together. I'll zoom in so you can see what I've done so far. So, excluding the background, I'm only using 3 colors for the skull. Raw sienna, burnt umber, and ivory black. So I'm diluting these 3 colors down, blending them with Gamsol, which is a mineral spirit, and I'm just adding thin layers, almost like how you'd paint with watercolors, to get dimension in this skull. So technically there are 2 light sources in this painting. There's a light source coming from this direction, and then the canvas itself is actually a light source. I'm using it as backlighting. So if you look at certain sections of the horn up here, where it looks kind of bright, it's actually just diluted raw sienna paint, and I'm utilizing the bright white of the canvas underneath to bring it to life. So for this section of the skull, which is where we're going to start, I am going to totally take advantage of the bright white of the canvas, and I'm just going to apply a very thin layer of paint first, and then slowly build it up, still letting some of this light sort of shine through. So this is the Gamsol I'm using to dilute the paint. If you were using water-soluble oil paints, you could just use water. And I just put a tiny amount in my trusty shot glass. And now we begin. So I'm just gonna get like a tiny amount of Gamsol on my brush, put it down on my palette, put a little raw sienna in it, little burnt umber, and a little ivory black. Probably too much of all of them. Just getting the excess off of my brush. And you can tell what color you're gonna get by what's coming off on the paper towel. I think it needs a little more raw sienna. So you see it is like a watercolor consistency. That seems like a better color for what I'm going for. Still too much paint on my brush. Yeah, so there's barely any paint on my brush, which is what I want for this first layer. So as you can see, it's just a really, really light wash. My main goal at this stage is just to get a relatively even, and by even I mean you can't really see any of my brush strokes, so an even layer of really thin paint, or a wash, if you will. And I'm gonna go just right up to this horn area. I'll deal with that later. Because of the light source, I want this section right here to be the lightest of all. And based on how I'm painting, it's much easier to add paint than try to take away paint. So I have to be careful. I'd rather put too little than too much. Another thing I'm trying not to do is erase my pencil markings, which can happen when you're using mineral spirits, which can be good or bad, but in this case I want them to stay there because I'm going to come back after this and fill in some detail to serve as guideposts for myself. Okay, I need to lighten this up, so I'm gonna get some paint off my brush on the paper towel. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video a little bit while I fill in these large sections. So there's a subtle shadow in here that I'm gonna kind of fill in, but I'll deal with it more in the next layer. Actually, I kind of want to get rid of the pencil now that I've added a slight differentiation. You can see the pencil marks disappearing. Alright, I'm gonna speed up the video again while I paint the rest of the face. The brushes that I'm using for this entire painting are a 1/4 inch angled brush, a 1/8 inch angled brush, a 0 round brush, and a 5/0 round brush. I'll add links below in case you'd like to purchase them. And I forgot to move my camera as I was painting down to the tip of the mouth, so we're gonna go right back up to the top and start adding more detail. You may notice as you watch this that I tend to start out with the bigger brushes, like the 1/4 inch angled brush, and I kind of do a wash or like bigger strokes, and then I might come in with a 1/8 angled brush or a 0 round brush and start doing finer detail, with the 5/0 round brush being the finest point, doing the final touches, the most detailed work last, and then maybe once it's all dry, I'll come back in with a bigger brush again, like the 1/4 inch angled brush, and do another wash on top. It's interesting, you know, bones and skulls, they have a grittiness to them, but they also have a softness to them. You know, there's a lot of different textures going on. So if you see me skipping around too on the painting, it's because probably I've got a little ADD, but also some of the paint is like drying, some of it's semi-dry, and I'm coming back in and maybe sweeping a big stroke across it to soften an edge, or I'm coming in to add a little extra detail while the paint is still drying, or after it's dry, just coming in and layering so that it's not quite a hard texture, but it's also not quite soft either. There's sort of a blending of these different textures. I mentioned earlier that with the way that I'm painting, it's much easier to add paint than take away paint. So as you can see while you're watching, I'm slowly building up texture and shadow with each layer being more opaque. You know, I'm adding more paint as I go along. And this is a great way to maintain the pockets of light and also to keep track of where I'm at. Sometimes it's easy to get carried away and then you end up with too much texture and too much shadow where there should be light. And so I'm painting slowly and building up the texture slowly so that it looks realistic. And I can always go back in and add more. All right, I'm happy with how this looks right now. So I'm gonna move the camera back up to the top of the painting and we'll start working on the horn. For this section of the horn, I'm using the same techniques that I was using for the face area of the skull, with emphasis on creating more extreme shadows around the edges. That helps give dimension to the horn. I noticed that as I was painting, I backed up a lot, 10, 15 feet or so to just make sure as I was going along that it looked right and also was complementary to the left side of where the horn got started. As I move onto the main section of the horn, I'm having trouble keeping all of the ridges separate from one another and going the right direction. So I'm going to mix it up. Instead of doing a wash first, I'm actually going to take the 5/0 round brush and I'm going to outline all of the ridges first and then come back in and do a wash. After that, I'll come back in with the smaller brushes and I'll add more detail and shadow. For the most part, I'm using undiluted ivory black and burnt umber for these ridges. However, towards the center of the horn, I'm diluting the paint a little bit in some sections, just because of how the light source is hitting the skull. So I'm gonna let the ridges dry first before I do the wash. And once it is dry, I'm gonna come in with some raw sienna. And in some areas, just because of how light it is, I am diluting the paint with a little bit of Gamsol. So to be honest, I am violating the fat over lean principle in some areas. I'm not super concerned just because these layers of paint are so thin and I'm waiting for them to dry before I add any new layers of paint. Okay, up here I'm using raw sienna and burnt umber, and I'm not actually diluting them, I'm just spreading them really thin. There's more shadow in this section, so it's a little darker. And just like the previous section of the horn that I was painting that attached to the skull, I'm adding a little more color, a little more shadow towards the edges of the horn, just to emphasize the dimension. So here's what it looks like on my palette. I'm grabbing raw sienna and a little bit of burnt umber and bringing it to the canvas. It really doesn't take that much paint. All right, I'm gonna speed up the video and move down the right side of the horn, and then I'll come back up to this section and add more detail. I'm gonna move up to this section and start adding more detail in a moment, but I wanted to back up and show you the whole painting. So the left side is going to be darker than the right side, but the right side is going to be darker than it looks right now. One thing I want to point out before I get started, and I'll zoom in as closely as I can, hopefully you can see, right along the edges of these ridges, I've added a thin line of raw sienna. And I've done this to add a bit of a glow, a bit of intensity. Back up so you can see. So I'm gonna add some of that detailing on this side as well. It's really just a stylistic choice. I'm not suggesting anyone has to do this. It's just something that I did. I'm using all of the brushes to add extra detail now. Specifically, I'm using the 5/0 round brush to add that thin line of raw sienna. I'm using the 1/4 inch angled brush to add sort of sweeping shadows, and then the 1/8 inch angled brush to add more subtle shadows and sort of diffuse any details that seem a little too hard-edged. The 0 round brush I'm just using to add specific details that don't need quite as fine of a point as the 5/0 round brush. So right here, I am using the angled brushes to create horizontal shadows along the ridges. This helps give the horns a more three-dimensional look. And now I'm just adding some extra random details, emphasizing certain shadows. As we come down the horn, I'm doing the same thing. The one thing I'm being mindful of is painting with the grain, if you will, of the ridges. Same thing here at the base of the horn. I'm just being mindful about kind of going with the flow, painting with the way the ridges are moving along the horn. I'll zoom in so you can get a closer look. For the most part right here, I'm using the 5/0 round brush because there's a lot of tiny little details that I want to add. All right, I'm pretty happy with how the skull looks, so I'm gonna zoom out. There's only one last thing I want to do now, which is to add a glaze with raw sienna to the background behind the skull, and also add shadows while I'm painting that glaze to make the skull look like it's against a green wall. I've got some raw sienna on my 1/4 inch angled brush, and I'm essentially massaging it into the background of the painting. I'm not trying to add that much color. You can see just a slight golden tint right above the brush. The reason why I'm using raw sienna instead of another color for the glaze is because raw sienna is the most prominent color I've used throughout this painting. So it's a way of unifying the background and the skull together and really giving the painting a mood. I've taken the raw sienna right up to the area where I want to add shadow. So on my brush, I've got a color that's just a little bit darker than the background, and I'm adding some shadow right up to the skull, and then I'll diffuse it as I take it out to the raw sienna. Here's the painting with some shadow on the left side, and here it is with some more shadow added on the right side. Now I'll show you a time lapse of the painting from start to finish. I hope this demo was helpful. Feel free to ask any questions below, and check out the description if you want to know more about what I was using to make this painting.